In the autumn of 1887, the mist-shrouded plantations of Blackwood County whispered with secrets that daylight could not burn away. Here, where the Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds and the cypress roots twisted deep into mud that had swallowed countless stories, one tale clawed its way to the surface through deathbed confessions and midnight testimonies. They spoke of Sycamore Reach, a plantation where the magnolias bloomed too sweet and the smokehouse fire never died, where a desperate father made a bargain that defied every law of God and man, offering his own flesh and blood to the very soul he owned, where hunger wore the face of respectability and the most monstrous appetite belonged not to the enslaved, but to the daughter of the house. The records whisper of vanished travelers and unexplained prosperity during lean times, of a family whose table groaned under mysterious abundance while their neighbors scraped empty plates, of a young woman whose impossible size defied the mathematics of poverty and whose small, delicate hands arranged more than just flowers on bone china. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe, but only if you honestly enjoy what we do here. What emerged from those whispered testimonies was not a simple tale of master and slave, but something far more nauseating. A story where the plantation's hunger turned inward, where blood called to blood with teeth bared, and where a daughter's rage became a feast that would consume the very source of her shame. This was not just murder. This was the moment when a family's darkest tradition finally devoured its own patriarch. To understand how such horror could take root, you must first see the soil in which it grew. Blackwood County stretched across the Louisiana bayou like a fever dream, where the boundary between water and earth dissolved into something that belonged to neither. Here, the cypress trees stood knee-deep in black water that reflected nothing, and the Spanish moss hung so thick it swallowed sound itself. At the heart of this wilderness sat Sycamore Reach, a plantation that had once commanded respect but now inspired only whispered pity. The main house loomed 3 stories high, its white columns stained yellow with moisture and neglect. Paint peeled like diseased skin from the shutters, and the wraparound porch sagged under the weight of decades spent pretending prosperity while rot ate through the foundation. What struck visitors most was not the decay, but the smoke. Day and night, a thin gray ribbon rose from the smokehouse behind the main quarters, carrying with it a scent that made the stomach turn, sweet and cloying like overripe fruit mixed with something indefinably wrong. The locals claimed it was just the way Silas Croft cured his meat, but dogs would whine and pull their owners away. When the wind shifted toward that building, the estate sprawled across 800 acres of swampland connected to the outside world by a single dirt road that flooded with every heavy rain. This isolation was deliberate. What seemed like simple geography was actually a fortress of silence, where screams carried only as far as the tree line, and witnesses numbered no more than the alligators sunning themselves on fallen logs. In this forsaken corner of creation, the Croft family had built their empire on secrets that festered in the humid air like an infected wound. What seemed like genteel poverty hid something unspeakable, something that had turned the very ground beneath Sycamore Reach into cursed earth that hungered for more than rain. The master of this decaying kingdom was Silas Croft, a man whose pride had curdled into something poisonous over the years. He stood barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, but carried himself with the bearing of a giant, his gray hair swept back with pomade that never quite masked the scent of sweat and desperation. His most treasured possession was a single silver spoon, tarnished black with age, which he polished obsessively during moments of deep thought, the metal catching firelight like a dying star. Silas spoke often of better days when cotton prices were high and the Croft name commanded respect at church socials and county fairs. But those who remembered his wife Maud knew the family's true transformation began with her death in 1885. She had wasted away from what the doctor called consumption, her once plump frame dwindling to nothing more than yellowed skin stretched over brittle bones. Yet the strangest thing was not her dying, but how the family seemed to thrive after her passing. Where Maud had been delicate and ethereal, their daughter Hester was her absolute opposite. By 1887, she weighed nearly 400 pounds, her massive frame draped in custom-sewn dresses that cost more than most families earned in a year. But it was her hands that people remembered most, small and delicate as a child's, incongruously graceful as they arranged food on her plate or smoothed the fabric of her skirts. Those hands moved with an unsettling precision, as if they knew secrets that her placid expression would never reveal. The contrast was impossible to ignore. While neighboring plantations struggled through the economic collapse that followed the war, the Crofts somehow maintained their lavish lifestyle. Their dinner table groaned under roasts and hams, exotic spices and imported wines, delicacies that should have been impossible to afford. Guests who managed to secure invitations left speaking of meals so rich they bordered on obscene, course after course of meat prepared with herbs that left a strange metallic aftertaste lingering for days. Hester presided over these feasts like a silent queen, her small mouth working methodically through portions that would feed a family of 6. She rarely spoke, but her pale eyes tracked every movement around the table with an intelligence that made visitors deeply uncomfortable. When she did break her silence, it was usually to compliment the meat, describing its texture and flavor with the expertise of a connoisseur discussing fine art. The family's strange abundance had a source no neighbor dared name, but the whispers followed them through town like smoke from their ever-burning fires. How did they maintain such prosperity when cotton had failed? Where did they source such quantities of the finest cuts when local butchers claimed they rarely made purchases? And why did their property seem to attract so many travelers who arrived but never seemed to leave? These questions hung in the humid air of Blackwood County like a curse, growing heavier with each passing season, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to demand answers. The first whisper of true horror came not from the main house, but from the stables where old Tom worked with the kind of silence that spoke louder than screams. He had been born into slavery on the Croft land, his gnarled hands missing 2 fingers from a cotton gin accident decades past, and his eyes held the weight of secrets that had turned his hair white before his 40th year. It was Tom who first spoke of the peddler, though only after 3 shots of corn whiskey had loosened his tongue enough to let the words escape. The man had arrived in the autumn of 1885, just months after Maud Croft's mysterious wasting death, driving a wagon painted bright yellow with red trim that announced his presence from miles away. He sold trinkets and tonics, ribbons and remedies, the kind of traveling merchant who made his living from the loneliness of isolated plantations. According to Tom's whispered testimony, the peddler had been a jovial sort, quick with a joke and generous with his samples. He had planned to stay only one night, but Silas Croft had been unusually hospitable, insisting the man remain as their guest for the week. There were repairs needed on his wagon wheel, Silas claimed, and the Croft hospitality was legendary. The peddler had laughed and accepted, charmed by the prospect of several days of fine meals and comfortable lodging. That was the last time anyone saw him alive and whole. Tom remembered the sounds that drifted from the main house that week, the scraping of heavy furniture being moved, the thud of something substantial hitting the floor. He remembered Hester's appetite seeming particularly voracious, her small hands cutting through portions of meat with unusual enthusiasm. Most disturbing of all, he remembered the smell that began emanating from the smokehouse, sweet and cloying like anise mixed with something that made his stomach turn. When questioned about the peddler's departure, Silas claimed the man had decided to push on toward New Orleans, eager to reach the city before the winter rains made travel impossible. He had left before dawn, Silas explained, not wanting to wake the household with his farewells. But Tom had been tending the horses at first light that morning, and no wagon had passed through the plantation gates. 3 weeks later, hunters found the distinctive yellow and red wagon half submerged in Devil's Creek, its contents scattered and rotting in the swamp water. Of the peddler himself, there was no trace beyond a single boot caught in the Spanish moss, as if he had simply vanished into the hungry earth that surrounded Sycamore Reach. The sheriff at the time, a man more concerned with property disputes than missing persons, declared it an unfortunate accident. Clearly, the peddler had attempted to ford the creek during high water and been swept away by the current. These things happened to travelers unfamiliar with the treacherous bayou terrain. The case was closed with barely an investigation, but old Tom knew the truth that festered beneath the official explanation. The wagon was found, but the peddler never was, and in the weeks that followed, the Croft family's meals grew richer still, their prosperity more pronounced, their appetites more disturbing to witness. What no one realized was that this was not an isolated incident, but the first glimpse of a system that had been perfected through years of practice, a machine that processed the unwanted and forgotten with the efficiency of a cotton gin. The community chose to forget what they could not explain, but the whispers persisted, growing stronger with each passing season, waiting for the next traveler who would discover that some invitations were not offers of hospitality, but summons to a table from which no guest ever truly departed. By 1888, Silas Croft faced a problem that no amount of polished silver or carefully prepared meals could solve. His daughter Hester had reached 23 years of age without a single serious suitor, and her prospects grew dimmer with each passing season. It was not merely her size that repelled potential husbands, though her 400-pound frame certainly presented practical challenges that most men found insurmountable. It was something deeper, something in the way her pale eyes followed movement around the dinner table, the unsettling precision with which she carved her meat, the way conversations died when she entered a room. Desperate to secure his family's legacy, Silas began extending invitations to the most unlikely candidates. First came his distant cousin Harold, a greedy man from Mobile who had heard whispers of the Croft prosperity and hoped to marry into money. Harold arrived with confidence but left 3 days later in the middle of the night, claiming urgent business matters required his immediate attention. Those who saw him departing noted his hollow expression and the way he clutched his stomach as if fighting nausea. Next was Edmund Thornfield, a bankrupt landowner from Mississippi whose gambling debts had consumed his inheritance. Edmund lasted nearly a week, charmed, initially by the lavish meals and Hester's surprising intelligence when it came to discussing business matters, but something about the evening feast on his 6th night sent him fleeing before dawn, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note apologizing for his sudden departure and a waistcoat that reeked of vomit. The pattern repeated itself with each potential suitor. They would arrive hopeful, drawn by rumors of the family's unexpected wealth during hard times. They would be welcomed with unprecedented hospitality, treated to meals so rich and abundant they bordered on obscene. But inevitably something would happen during those elaborate dinners that sent them running into the night, their faces drained of color, and their hands trembling as they hitched their horses with desperate haste. Hester watched these departures with a mixture of rage and bitter satisfaction. She knew what drove them away, understood the revulsion that crept into their eyes when they witnessed her appetite, the way they flinched when her small hands moved with such practiced efficiency through portions of meat that should have fed an entire family. She saw how they looked at her, not as a woman to be courted, but as a grotesque curiosity to be endured for the sake of potential financial gain. After the last suitor's midnight flight, Silas stood on the front porch in his nightshirt, watching the dust cloud disappear into the darkness. His carefully maintained facade of genteel prosperity was crumbling, and with it, his dreams of continuing the Croft line through legitimate marriage. The family's dark traditions required secrecy, and Hester's condition made discretion increasingly impossible. It was then, in that moment of desperate fury, that his gaze fell upon Elijah working by lamplight in his workshop behind the main house. The enslaved man was repairing a broken chair leg, his skilled hands moving with the kind of precision that had made him invaluable to the plantation's operations. And in that instant, an idea took root in Silas's mind, an idea so audacious and unthinkable that it seemed to come from the devil himself. Each suitor fled faster than the last, and Silas's options were running out. But perhaps the solution had been under his roof all along, waiting in the shadows where desperation and madness converged into something that would damn them all. According to the hidden ledger that would later emerge from the walls of Elijah's workshop, the conversation that changed everything took place on a November morning when the fog rolled in thick enough to swallow sound. Silas approached the workshop where Elijah was crafting a new dining table, the irony of which would not become apparent until much later. The master's hands shook as he polished his tarnished silver spoon, the nervous habit that preceded his most desperate decisions. The offer was laid out with the calculated precision of a business transaction. Elijah would marry Hester and take her away from Sycamore Reach, removing the stain of her unmarriageable status from the Croft name. In exchange, he would receive his freedom papers and 40 acres of good bottomland along the eastern border of the plantation. It was an offer that defied every social convention of the Deep South, a bargain that would have scandalized polite society if it had ever become public knowledge. But what Silas did not reveal, what Elijah would not discover until it was too late to escape, was the true source of the Croft family's unnatural prosperity. Hidden beneath the floorboards of the smokehouse lay the machinery of horror that had sustained them through lean years when neighboring plantations failed. The building that never ceased its cooking fires was not merely preserving ham and bacon, but processing a more forbidden harvest. For years, the system had operated with ruthless efficiency. Travelers who sought shelter during storms found themselves permanent guests. Drifters looking for work disappeared into the swamps after accepting Croft hospitality. The lonely and forgotten, those whose absence would raise no alarm, were drawn to Sycamore Reach like moths to flame. What happened to them in that smokehouse would have horrified even the most hardened observers. The process was methodical, almost industrial in its organization. The initial preparation took place in the root cellar behind the main house, where Silas had installed specialized equipment that he claimed was for butchering livestock. The bodies were then transported to the smokehouse, where they were processed with the same care and attention given to the finest cuts of beef or pork. Salt and exotic spices masked the distinctive taste, while careful preparation eliminated any texture that might betray the true nature of what graced the Croft dinner table. Hester had been raised on this diet from childhood, her massive frame a testament to years of consuming what her father euphemistically called the special larder. Her incredible size was not merely the result of overindulgence, but of a lifetime spent feeding on a source of protein that was both abundant and terrible. She had never known hunger, never experienced the lean times that plagued their neighbors, because the Croft family had solved the problem of sustenance in the most monstrous way imaginable. If you're still watching, hit subscribe so you don't miss the truths history tried to bury. The offer wasn't kindness, it was a transaction that would damn them both. Elijah, faced with the impossible choice between a lifetime of bondage and a freedom purchased with marriage to a woman whose very existence defied nature, saw no alternative but acceptance. He could not have known that in agreeing to Silas's proposal, he was not gaining liberation but entering a different kind of prison, one with walls built from shared complicity in unspeakable acts. What he discovered too late was that the Croft family's hunger was not merely for flesh, but for the continuation of their abominable tradition, and that his role in this arrangement was not as Hester's husband, but as the next caretaker of a system that had fed on human lives for decades. The bargain that promised freedom would instead bind him to horrors that made slavery seem merciful by comparison. The discovery that would shatter everything came by pure accident, though perhaps in a house built on so many secrets, such revelations were inevitable. Elijah had been repairing a section of water-damaged wall in Silas's private study when his chisel broke through the plaster to reveal a hollow space behind the wooden paneling. Inside that hidden cavity, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture, lay a document that would turn predator into prey with the stroke of a pen. The draft of Silas Croft's last will and testament, dated October 1888 but bearing no signature, told a story of betrayal so calculated it took Elijah's breath away. The carefully worded legal language laid out Silas's true intentions with cold precision. Upon his death, Sycamore Reach and all its holdings would pass not to his daughter Hester, but to a male heir to be determined at the time of my passing. The 40 acres promised to Elijah were described as a temporary grant, subject to revocation upon the discovery of moral turpitude or criminal behavior. But the most chilling revelation came in a handwritten note attached to the draft, penned in Silas's distinctive script. The marriage to Elijah was described as a temporary solution to an embarrassing problem, designed to remove Hester from polite society while maintaining the family's respectability. Once she was safely married and living off the plantation, Silas intended to claim that Elijah had attempted to harm his wife, justification enough to reclaim both the land and the man himself. The enslaved carpenter would find himself back in chains, while Hester would be quietly confined to an asylum for her protection. The note went further, revealing that Silas had already begun correspondence with a distant male cousin in Virginia, a man who had agreed to inherit the plantation and maintain its unique traditions in exchange for a generous yearly income. The Croft legacy of cannibalism would continue uninterrupted, with Hester removed from the equation and Elijah returned to his proper place as property rather than family. Reading those words by lamplight in the damaged study, Elijah felt the walls of his supposed freedom closing in around him. Every kindness Silas had shown, every promise of liberation, had been calculated deception designed to solve the master's problems while leaving his victims more trapped than before. The marriage certificate that was meant to symbolize his freedom was actually a warrant for his eventual re-enslavement. Troubled by the weight of this knowledge, Elijah sought out the only person on the plantation who might understand the depths of Silas's duplicity. Old Tom listened to the revelation with the weary resignation of a man who had witnessed too many betrayals to register surprise, but his response chilled Elijah more than the document itself. "Master's house been eating its own for generations," Tom said, his two-fingered hand tracing patterns in the dirt. "Started with Marcy Silas's daddy, then his daddy before him. Always been hungry, that house. Always been looking for fresh meat to keep the tradition alive. But sometimes," he paused, his ancient eyes reflecting decades of accumulated horror, "sometimes the meat fights back." The old man's cryptic warning proved prophetic in ways that Elijah could not have imagined. When Hester cornered him the following evening, demanding to know why he had seemed so distracted during dinner, he found himself unable to maintain the deception. Perhaps it was the weight of shared secrets, Or perhaps he recognized in her pale eyes the same desperation that had driven him to accept Silas's bargain in the first place. Whatever the reason, he revealed the contents of the hidden will. Hester's reaction was not the hysteria or tears that Elijah might have expected. Instead, she listened with the cold attention of a predator learning the location of prey. When he finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment, her small hands folded carefully in her lap, her massive frame unnaturally still. Then she smiled, and in that moment Elijah saw not a victim of her father's cruelty, but a creature who had just realized that the hunter had become the hunted. The paper Elijah found would turn predator into prey, but he had gravely miscalculated which of them would be feeding and which would be devoured. What happened on the night of November 12, 1888, can only be reconstructed from fragments pieced together from Elijah's tortured ledger entries and the physical evidence he was forced to help conceal. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning the plantation roads into rivers of mud and ensuring that no one would venture out to witness what was about to unfold at Sycamore Reach. According to Elijah's careful documentation, written in a hand that trembled with each word, Hester had spent the day in unusual preparation. She had dismissed the house servants early, claiming a headache that required complete silence. She had prepared dinner herself, an elaborate affair featuring roasted duck with her father's favorite spiced wine. Most telling of all, she had sharpened every carving knife in the kitchen to a razor's edge, claiming she wanted to properly present the meal. The confrontation began during the evening meal, when Hester produced the unsigned will from beneath her dinner napkin like a magician revealing a trick. Silas, caught mid-bite with a forkful of duck, went white as cemetery marble when he recognized his own handwriting. His silver spoon clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the dining room like a death knell. Elijah, working late in his shop, heard the voices rising from the main house around 9 o'clock that evening. First came Silas's bluster, his attempts to explain away the document as a mere precaution, a father's natural concern for protecting his legacy. Then Hester's voice, low and steady, reading aloud the most damning passages with the methodical precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. The sound that came next was unlike anything Elijah had ever heard, a wet thud followed by the crash of overturning furniture. Then silence, heavy and terrible, broken only by the sound of something being dragged across hardwood floors. When he was finally summoned to the main house an hour later, Elijah found Hester waiting for him in the kitchen, her dress pristinely clean except for a few drops of what might have been wine staining the bodice. The dining room told a different story. Chairs lay overturned, the elegant table service scattered across the floor among puddles of spilled wine and gravy. A single drop of blood, dark as molasses in the lamplight, marked the spot where Silas's silver spoon had fallen. But of the master himself, there was no trace beyond a torn piece of his vest, caught on the corner of the overturned dining table. Hester's instructions were delivered with the calm authority of someone accustomed to command. Elijah was to clean the dining room thoroughly, removing every trace of the struggle. The broken china was to be gathered and buried in the garden. The blood-stained tablecloth was to be burned in the smokehouse fire, which had been burning unusually hot since sunset. Most importantly, he was to remember that Silas had gone to bed early with a headache and was not to be disturbed. As Elijah worked through the night, scrubbing floors and walls with lye soap that burned his hands raw, he became aware of activity in the smokehouse behind the main quarters. The fire blazed higher than he had ever seen it, sending sparks dancing into the rain-soaked darkness. The smell that drifted from that building was familiar yet wrong, carrying notes of anise and exotic spices that could not quite mask an underlying sweetness that made his stomach rebel. By dawn, the dining room was spotless, the evidence of violence erased as thoroughly as if it had never occurred. But Elijah's ledger entry for that day written in a hand that shook so violently the words were barely legible, told the truth that the clean floors concealed. The sow has turned on the boar. The larder is full. I am a husband now. The sounds from behind the study door told a story of reckoning, but the silence that followed whispered of something far more terrible than simple murder. In helping her hide the crime, Elijah had become part of the Croft family tradition, bound to it by a secret more powerful than any chain slavery had ever forged. Sheriff John Hale arrived at Sycamore Reach on the morning of November 15th, 3 days after Silas. Croft had supposedly vanished into the Louisiana mist. He came not as an investigator pursuing justice, but as a reluctant public servant responding to what he assumed would be another routine missing person report. Hale was a practical man who preferred dealing with property disputes and tax collection, finding such matters far more straightforward than the messy complications that arose when people simply disappeared. Hester met him at the front door, draped in mourning black that emphasized her massive frame, while somehow lending her an air of tragic dignity. Her performance was masterful in its simplicity, the worried daughter wringing her small hands as she explained how her father had stormed from the house following a violent argument about her upcoming marriage. She dabbed at dry eyes with a handkerchief that never grew damp, speaking in the breathless tones of someone barely containing their grief. According to her carefully rehearsed account, Silas had been drinking heavily that evening, raging about the shame she had brought upon the family name through her unmarriageable condition. When she had tried to defend herself, suggesting that her union with Elijah might actually benefit the plantation's operations, he had flown into a fury unlike anything she had ever witnessed. He had swept from the dining room, shouting about business matters that required his immediate attention in New Orleans, and had ridden off into the storm without so much as packing a traveling bag. Elijah stood silently beside her throughout this recitation, his face a mask of humble concern that revealed nothing of the horror he had witnessed. When questioned directly by the sheriff, he corroborated Hester's story with the practiced servility of a man accustomed to supporting his betters' version of events. Yes, he had heard raised voices from the main house. Yes, Master Silas had seemed agitated in recent days. Yes, the master often took sudden trips when plantation business demanded his attention. Sheriff Hale's investigation was perfunctory at best, consisting mainly of a cursory examination of the house's public rooms and a brief walk around the immediate grounds. The dining room, scrubbed clean by Elijah's desperate nighttime labor, showed no signs of violence. The master's study appeared undisturbed, its papers neatly arranged, and its furniture positioned exactly as one would expect. Even Silas's bedroom seemed to support the story of a hasty departure, with clothes scattered about as if he had packed in anger and haste. What the sheriff did notice, though he chose not to comment upon it, was the overwhelming smell of lye soap that permeated the main house, so strong it made his eyes water. He also observed the unusually clean state of every surface, as if the entire building had been scrubbed from floor to ceiling in the past few days. But these details struck him as evidence of household efficiency rather than criminal activity, the natural response of good servants to their master's absence. The smokehouse, still sending its thin ribbon of smoke into the gray November sky, received only a passing glance. When Hale mentioned the persistent fire, Hester explained that they were curing their winter meat supply, a process that required constant attention and could not be interrupted even by family emergencies. The smell that drifted from that building, sweet and cloying with exotic spices, was dismissed as evidence of the family's sophisticated palate rather than anything more sinister. Most crucially, Sheriff Hale was a man who understood the social dynamics of Blackwood County well enough to recognize when discretion was more valuable than diligence. The Crofts were old money, respected despite their eccentricities, and Silas's reputation for erratic behavior was well established. A missing patriarch who had stormed off in a drunken rage was hardly unprecedented in a region where pride often outweighed common sense. The case was effectively closed before it had truly begun. Hale's official report, filed in his disruption log with minimal detail, noted simply that Silas Croft had been reported missing by his daughter following a domestic dispute, that no evidence of foul play had been discovered, and that the missing man's departure was consistent with his known patterns of behavior. The matter was classified as a voluntary disappearance pending further developments that would never come. With the law satisfied by the simplest explanation, the gates of Sycamore Reach closed once again, sealing in secrets that would fester like infection in an untreated wound. The perfect lie had been believed because it conformed to expectations, because it required no uncomfortable questions, and because the truth was too monstrous for civilized minds to contemplate. But lies, no matter how perfectly crafted, cast shadows that grow longer with time, and in those shadows, a new and terrifying order was beginning to take shape. The mathematics of horror reveal themselves most clearly in the careful accounting of evil, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the stark contrast between what the official records claimed and what the private documentation revealed. The Sycamore Reach Plantation ledger, maintained with meticulous care for the county tax assessor, told one story. Elijah's hidden journal, sealed behind the walls of his workshop, whispered a far more damning truth. In the weeks following Silas's disappearance, the plantation's official accounts showed a sudden and dramatic shift in purchasing patterns that should have raised immediate suspicion among anyone paying attention. Where the ledger had previously recorded regular orders for beef and pork from the local butchers, those entries ceased entirely after November 12th. In their place appeared massive purchases of salt, black pepper, anise seed, and exotic spices in quantities that dwarfed anything the plantation had ever acquired. The sugar purchases alone told a story of obscene preparation. 40 pounds of brown sugar, 20 pounds of white, followed by industrial quantities of vinegar and curing salts that would have been sufficient to preserve an entire herd of cattle. The timing was unmistakable, these purchases beginning within days of Silas's vanishing and continuing with methodical regularity through the winter months. But it was Elijah's private ledger that provided the context for these numbers, his careful handwriting documenting the truth behind the innocuous business transactions. The entry dated November 14th, written in ink that seemed to tremble on the page, contained only 7 words that explained everything. The sow has turned on the boar. The following entry, dated 3 days later, expanded on this cryptic observation with devastating clarity. The larder is full. Mistress Hester oversees the smokehouse with new authority. The fires burn day and night. The smell changes everything. I am a husband now, bound by shared sin more tightly than any legal bond. Freedom was always an illusion, but this prison has walls built from complicity in the unspeakable. More telling still was the entry from December 1st, which revealed the full extent of Hester's transformation from victim to predator. She has taken complete control of the household operations. The servants follow her orders without question. She manages the finances with intelligence I never suspected, calculating expenses and profits with the precision of a trained accountant. But it is in the smokehouse where her true nature emerges. She supervises every detail of the curing process, tasting and adjusting spices with the expertise of someone who has been preparing this particular type of meat her entire life. The financial records supported this disturbing narrative in ways that made the truth undeniable. In January of 1889, an extravagant purchase appeared in the books, a custom wedding dress from a New Orleans boutique specializing in clothing for women of unusual proportions. The cost was staggering, more than most families spent on shelter for an entire year, but it represented something far more significant than mere vanity. It was a declaration of victory, a celebration of power seized rather than inherited. That same month, new legal documents appeared among the Plantation papers, hastily drawn up by a lawyer from Baton Rouge, who clearly preferred not to ask uncomfortable questions about his client's circumstances. The deed to the 40 acres promised to Elijah was officially transferred, but with restrictions that ensured his continued dependence on his new wife's goodwill. He was granted use of the land, but not true ownership, a distinction that meant his freedom existed only at Hester's sufferance. The numbers told a story of consumption, but only Elijah's private words revealed the true nature of the feast. By spring of 1889, Hester had emerged as the undisputed master of Sycamore Reach, her authority established not through inheritance, but through the most primal assertion of dominance imaginable. She had literally consumed her father's opposition to her will, and in doing so had transformed herself from unwanted daughter into the architect of her own terrible destiny. The ledgers, both official and private, bore witness to a transaction more profound than any recorded in the history of Blackwood County. Power had changed hands through an act so monstrous that it defied documentation, leaving behind only the circumstantial evidence of spice purchases and the trembling confessions of a man who had witnessed the birth of a new kind of monster. For generations, the story that filtered through the whispered conversations of Blackwood County followed a predictable narrative, one that satisfied both the community's need for explanation and their deep-seated assumptions about power, race, and justice in the antebellum South. The tale they told themselves was simple and familiar. A desperate plantation owner had offered his unmarriageable daughter to his most skilled slave, and the enslaved man had taken his revenge by murdering his master and claiming both freedom and property through violence. This version of events fit comfortably within the established patterns of folklore and fear that had shaped the region's collective memory for decades. It confirmed every prejudice about the dangers of treating enslaved people with anything approaching equality, every assumption about the inevitable violence that would result from disrupting the natural order of society. When neighbors spoke of Sycamore Reach in hushed tones, they spoke of Elijah as a man who had been given too much freedom and had used it to destroy the hand that fed him. But this comfortable narrative, this explanation that required no uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil or the complexities of human monstrosity, was built on a foundation of willful blindness. The truth was far more disturbing than a simple story of slave rebellion, far more complex than the familiar patterns of master and servant that defined their world. The real horror of Sycamore Reach was not that an enslaved man had killed his owner, but that a daughter had devoured her father, literally and completely, transforming herself from victim into predator through an act of cannibalistic patricide that defied every assumption about feminine weakness and filial duty. The monster that emerged from that November night was not the one the community expected, not the vengeful slave they could understand and fear in familiar ways, but something far more terrifying in its unexpected nature. Elijah's role in this tragedy was not that of a calculating killer seizing his opportunity for freedom, but of a witness trapped by circumstances beyond his control. His crime was not murder but complicity, not violence but silence. He had become an accomplice to horror not through choice but through the impossible position in which Silas's bargain had placed him. When faced with the evidence of Hester's patricide, he had chosen survival over heroism, self-preservation over justice. The freedom that Silas had promised him as payment for marrying his daughter had indeed been delivered, but in a form more terrible than anything he could have imagined. He was free from the legal bonds of slavery, only to find himself imprisoned by something far more powerful: the shared knowledge of unspeakable acts, the complicity in crimes that bound him to his monstrous wife more tightly than any chain. His 40 acres of bottomland, officially granted and legally documented, became not a symbol of liberation but a gilded cage that he could never truly leave. To claim his independence would mean abandoning the secret that protected them both, and to abandon that secret would mean facing consequences that made his previous bondage seem merciful by comparison. He was free to work his own land, free to make his own decisions, but never free to escape the shadow of what he had helped to conceal. The tragic irony of Elijah's situation was that, in accepting what appeared to be the opportunity of a lifetime, he had actually traded one form of servitude for another far more terrible. Where once he had been owned by a master's legal authority, he was now possessed by a wife's monstrous appetite and his own guilty knowledge. The papers that proclaimed his freedom were worthless when weighed against the invisible chains forged in that blood-soaked dining room. The community's assumption that he was the villain of this story served Hester's purposes perfectly, deflecting attention from the true nature of what had transpired at Sycamore Reach. While neighbors whispered about the dangerous slave who had murdered his betters, the real monster continued her reign over the plantation, her massive frame casting shadows that grew longer with each passing season. The monster of Sycamore Reach had finally taken her throne, but she had done so by allowing others to believe that the crown belonged to someone else entirely, someone whose guilt was assumed rather than proven, whose monstrosity was expected rather than revealed. In this way, Hester achieved the perfect crime. Not only had she eliminated her father and secured her inheritance, but she had done so in a manner that ensured the blame would fall elsewhere, leaving her free to rule her domain without interference or suspicion. The wedding that bound Hester Croft to Elijah took place on a gray February morning in 1889, officiated by Reverend Albright in a ceremony so small and hurried, it seemed designed to escape notice rather than celebrate union. The preacher's hand shook as he read from his worn Bible, his voice barely rising above a whisper as he pronounced them husband and wife. He had agreed to perform the service only after Hester made it clear that his continued welcome in Blackwood County depended on his discretion and cooperation. The bride wore her custom dress from New Orleans, a creation of ivory silk and Belgian lace that had cost more than most plantation houses. The elaborate gown did nothing to soften her massive frame, instead emphasizing the grotesque disproportion between her size and the delicate craftsmanship of the fabric. She stood perfectly still throughout the brief ceremony, her small hands folded at her waist, her pale eyes fixed on some point beyond the assembled witnesses, with the satisfied expression of someone watching long-laid plans come to fruition. Elijah wore his finest clothes, a dark suit that had belonged to Silas and had been altered to fit his smaller frame. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. He was literally wearing the dead man's garments as he married the dead man's daughter, a fitting costume for his role as both beneficiary and prisoner of her monstrous inheritance. His face revealed nothing of his inner turmoil, but those who knew him well noted the hollow quality of his eyes, the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking. The few witnesses present included old Tom, whose ancient face showed no surprise at the proceedings, and 2 house servants whose continued employment depended on their ability to forget what they had seen. The wedding photograph, taken by a traveling photographer who had been paid handsomely for his discretion, captured the essential truth of the arrangement with devastating clarity. Hester stood triumphant and satisfied, while Elijah appeared hollow and defeated, a man attending his own funeral rather than his wedding. In the months that followed, Hester revealed business acumen that surprised even those who had known her since childhood. She managed the plantation's finances with mathematical precision, negotiating contracts and managing investments with the shrewdness of someone who understood that money was simply another form of power to be accumulated and wielded. The estate, which had struggled under Silas's increasingly erratic management, began to prosper in ways that defied the economic realities facing their neighbors. Her transformation from unwanted daughter to plantation mistress was complete in every detail except the most fundamental one. She maintained separate living quarters from her husband, ostensibly out of consideration for his comfort, but actually as a means of preserving the independence she had fought so hard to achieve. Elijah lived in a cabin near his workshop, close enough to be summoned when needed, but far enough away to maintain the fiction that their marriage was anything other than a business arrangement sealed in blood. The smokehouse continued its constant operation under her direct supervision, the thin ribbon of smoke rising from its chimney like a banner, announcing her dominion over life and death itself. She personally oversaw every aspect of the curing process, tasting and adjusting seasonings with the expertise of someone who had been raised on this particular cuisine. The servants learned to ask no questions about the source of the meat they were instructed to prepare, understanding that their continued employment and safety depended on their willful blindness. To the outside world, Hester presented herself as a grieving daughter, managing her father's legacy with admirable competence. She attended church services with appropriate solemnity, made charitable donations with calculated generosity, and spoke of Silas's disappearance with the resigned sadness of someone who had accepted that some mysteries were beyond human understanding. Her performance was flawless because it was built on a foundation of absolute confidence in her own power. The official records reflected this new reality with bureaucratic precision. Tax documents listed her as head of household. Property deeds bore her signature with bold flourishes, and business correspondence arrived, addressed to Mrs. Hester Croft rather than Miss. She had achieved something that would have been impossible through conventional means: complete independence and authority in a world designed to deny both to women like herself. But perhaps most chilling of all was the way she wore her victory with such natural grace, as if the throne she had claimed through patricide was always meant to be hers. The wedding photo showed one victor and one prisoner, but it also revealed something far more disturbing about the nature of power and the appetites that drive people to claim it through the most unthinkable means. The years that followed Hester's ascension passed with deceptive quiet, the plantation settling into a routine of genteel prosperity under the widow's capable management. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, patterns emerged that suggested the hunger which had consumed Silas Croft was far from satisfied by a single meal. The 1920 census listed her as a widow aged 55, residing with a groundskeeper named Elijah, aged approximately 62. No mention was made of their legal marriage, the bond that had once promised freedom but delivered only bondage. To the government clerk, they appeared simply as employer and employee, a prosperous woman and her trusted servant. But those familiar with the property's history noted troubling continuities. The smokehouse still sent its thin ribbon of smoke into the sky with mechanical regularity, fires burning constantly for over 30 years. Travelers reported strange encounters near Sycamore Reach, stories of being invited to stay the night by a massive woman with unnaturally small hands, only to find themselves fleeing before dawn with no clear memory of what had frightened them. The most disturbing echo came in 1928, when traveling salesman Marcus Webb disappeared while working Blackwood County's rural routes. His leather-bound ledger was found abandoned in his automobile, 3 miles from the plantation gates. The last entry, dated November 10th, simply read, "Promising lead at Croft Place. Large woman interested in kitchen implements. Will stay for dinner." Sheriff Hale, now elderly and more interested in retirement than investigation, conducted the same perfunctory search he had performed 40 years earlier. He found no trace of Webb beyond his abandoned car. Hester received him with the same tragic dignity she had displayed during her father's disappearance, explaining that the salesman had visited but decided to continue his journey toward New Orleans. The pattern seemed almost scripted, down to the excessive cleanliness of the main house and the overwhelming scent of lye soap. Hale filed his report with minimal detail, classifying Webb as a voluntary disappearance, another traveling man who had simply chosen to vanish into the vast anonymity of the American road. What disturbed those few observers who possessed both memory and imagination was the systematic nature of these incidents. Every few years, someone would disappear near Sycamore Reach, always a person whose absence would raise minimal alarm. A drifter, a traveling merchant, someone whose connections to the community were temporary and fragile. The timing suggested a cycle, a rhythm of consumption maintained with the precision of a well-tuned machine. The hunger of Sycamore Reach did not die with its patriarch, but had evolved into something more sustainable, more carefully hidden from public scrutiny. What had begun as a family's monstrous secret had transformed into an institution, a tradition that outlived its creators and continued to feed on the margins of society, where the disappeared were quickly forgotten and the missing were rarely mourned. The end came not with violence or drama, but with the quiet inevitability of nature reclaiming what had always belonged to it. Hester Croft died in her sleep on a humid July morning in 1935, her massive frame finally succumbing to decades spent consuming more than any human body was designed to process. Her obituary painted the portrait of a respected widow who had managed her father's plantation with admirable competence for nearly 5 decades. What it did not mention was the strange sense of relief that settled over the county following her death. Neighbors found themselves sleeping more soundly, though they could not have explained why. The roads that had once felt dangerous after dark somehow seemed safer, as if a predator that had stalked the countryside for generations had finally been called to its final rest. Elijah's response to his wife's death was as enigmatic as everything else about their bizarre arrangement. He appeared at the funeral standing silently beside the massive coffin, his expression showing not grief but something far more complex. Relief mixed with terror, freedom shadowed by the knowledge that some secrets die harder than the people who create them. In the weeks following the funeral, Elijah began the systematic destruction of everything connected to the plantation's dark history. The smokehouse was torn down and burned in a fire that sent black smoke billowing across the county for 3 days. The root cellar was filled with concrete and sealed forever. Hester's elaborate dresses were burned, her jewelry scattered in the swamp, her cooking implements buried so deeply in the Louisiana mud that they would never again see daylight. The final entry in Elijah's hidden ledger, discovered years later during demolition, consisted of only 4 words: "The hunger is dead." Below this, in different ink, appeared a single additional line: "I pray it stays buried." By autumn of 1935, Elijah had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. The 40 acres granted to him decades earlier were found abandoned, his cabin empty except for scattered belongings that suggested hasty departure. Some claimed he had headed north, while others whispered that he had simply walked into the swamp one night and allowed the dark water to swallow his secrets along with his body. The plantation itself stood empty for less than 2 years before the Louisiana Bayou began its patient work of reclamation. By 1940, the main house was uninhabitable, and by 1950, barely recognizable as human construction. The swamp waters rose with each heavy rain, gradually submerging the foundation stones and erasing the last physical evidence of the Croft family's reign of hunger. What had once been Sycamore Reach became nothing more than a patch of standing water, indistinguishable from the thousands of other forgotten places where the bayou had reclaimed what civilization had briefly claimed as its own. In the end, the waters of Blackwood County swallowed more than just timber and stone. They digested a story that reveals uncomfortable truths about the appetites that lurk beneath the surface of respectability and the terrible mathematics of power that transforms victims into predators. The tale of Sycamore Reach forces us to confront a disturbing reality. The most monstrous acts often emerge not from obvious villains, but from those society has taught us to pity. Hester Croft was supposed to be the victim, the unwanted daughter whose only crime was failing to meet impossible standards. Instead, she became something far more terrifying, precisely because her evil wore the mask of victimhood until it no longer needed to hide. Her father's attempt to dispose of her backfired in ways he could never have imagined. In trying to rid himself of what he saw as a burden, Silas created the very instrument of his own destruction. The daughter he tried to discard discovered appetites that made his seem restrained, and the intelligence to satisfy those hungers long after his bones had been ground to nothing. Perhaps most chilling is the realization that Hester's transformation was not an aberration, but logical progression. Raised on human flesh and taught that her worth was measured by her ability to disappear quietly, she learned lessons her father never intended. She absorbed the truth that power belongs to those willing to consume whatever stands in their way. The swamp that claimed Sycamore Reach serves as metaphor for how history digests its most uncomfortable truths. Like dark water that swallowed the plantation's foundations, time erases evidence while leaving essential horror intact, buried, but not destroyed. Subscribe if you want to uncover more truths that history tried to swallow. The hunger that consumed Sycamore Reach reminds us that the most dangerous predators are often those we least expect, those who transform their pain into power and their victimhood into license to victimize others. In a world that creates monsters through its own cruelties, we should never be surprised when those monsters devour their creators with methodical efficiency.